Thank you all so much for joining us today. This is really a privilege to be doing this. This is kind of part of a theme this week because, as you'll hear about later, and I know Tish will share this information too, Chamber Music on the Fox is putting together a concert program on next Monday evening of the music dedicated to the artists who perished in the Holocaust, um, featuring music by Gideon Klein and Erwin Schulhoff, uh, Holocaust era um, composers, as well as the music of Andrei Previn, a contemporary composer whose clarinet quintet he dedicated to the artists of Terezin. So hope that you can join us for that on Monday night. It's also virtual, and we'll be sharing all the information. But to get back to this tonight, um, the music of Terezin. This topic is not a light one, but I think by the end, you'll come away with a deeper appreciation for some of the beauty, creativity, and artistry that can come out of darkness and defiance. So I first became interested in the music that came out of the Holocaust because of a particularly inspiring college professor in Boston, where I went to school. She taught me about the composers Victor Ullmann, Hans Krasse, Pavel Haas, and some of the others that you'll hear about today. And I ended up traveling with her to St. Petersburg, Russia to learn more and also to educate about some of these incredible stories and music that came out of the Holocaust. The resilience it took to create music and organize performances during the most terrifying of situations is truly a testament to the power that art can provide to humanity during our darkest hours. But before I get into some of this music, I just want to start by going over a little bit of the history of Terezin itself. So, the town, Terezin, is located in North Bohemia, just 30 miles northwest of Prague. It was originally built as a holiday resort for Czech nobility. In 1780, the Emperor Joseph II ordered the erection of the fortress, which he named Theresienstadt after his mother, the Empress Maria Theresa. The city also served as a fortress to protect Prague from invaders to the north. The Austrians used it to strengthen their defense system against the Prussians. During the second half of the 19th century was when the fortress began to be used as a prison. During the First World War, it was used as a political prison camp. Many thousand supporters of Russia were placed by Austro-Hungarian authorities in the fortress. In 1918, with the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the town became part of the newly formed state of Czechoslovakia. Several decades later, after the Nazis occupied Czechoslovakia, the 7,000 Czechs who lived in the town before the Nazis took over were expelled during June of 1942 to make way for the Jews that they would be transporting in. And before I move on, just take a look at the picture on the left, because I'll sort of be referencing this on the next slide, that there's kind of an upper, larger fortress and also a lower fortress to take note of. That these are two different different parts of the Terezin ghetto that were used for very different purposes. So, after the occupation of Czechoslovakia in 1939, the Nazis originally used Terezin as a military base, but prison camps began to fill up, and the Prague Gestapo police prison was set up in the small fortress there in 1940. That small fortress was that one on the bottom of the picture. Eventually, Germany assigned the Gestapo to adapt the rest of Terezin as a ghetto and transit camp in 1941. In the town of Terezin, the population had normally been around 5,000 people before the war, and even during wartime, around 11,000 soldiers could be placed here. But at the height of World War II, the ghetto or camp Terezin held over 55,000 Jews. Now, while the majority of the Jews sent to Terezin were sent to the ghetto on the north side of town, that larger ghetto, the prison in the small fortress was used for anyone who tried to escape or was part of the resistance, and this included artists who tried to smuggle out art that depicted the reality of life in the camp. Initially, Terezin was to be primarily a ghetto for the elderly. The Nazis deported anyone over 65 who was not fit for a labor camp. Also to be transferred were Jewish, German, and Austrian World War I veterans who met at least one of two criteria. They were severely disabled due to war wounds, or they were veterans that were awarded the Iron Cross First Class or above. Later, a third very important category of Jews was added to the eligibility list for Theresienstadt. These were prominent Jews, especially artists, musicians, and other cultural figures whose disappearance in a killing center might have provoked inquiry from their communities or even from abroad. In total, from 1941 to 1944, more than 150,000 Jews were sent there, including 15,000 children. And although it was not an extermination camp, about 33,000 died in the ghetto due to the appalling conditions arising out of extreme population density, malnutrition, and disease. So Terezin was used both as a way station for those being sent to other camps farther east, and also as a place to house very specific populations of Jews, including decorated veterans of World War I, the elderly, and of course, notably, these prominent individuals whose disappearance could be widely reported, or also who would be unfit for forced labor. The inmates included a number of famous poets, painters, musicians, composers, and scholars. And so partly for this reason, Terezin had an unusual number of cultural activities for adults and children, and some artwork and music created there did survive the war, thankfully. We'll be talking today about the music of Terezin, but of course there was so much other art, including poetry and art created by children, most notably that which was collected for the book I Never Saw Another Butterfly. In Terezin, the remarkable musical and theatrical life of Czechoslovakia was actually permitted, defiantly, to thrive, and great music was composed and performed by those condemned. You could hear the symphonic and chamber works of Mozart, Beethoven, Brahms, Janáček, in addition to famous operas like Tosca or Carmen or The Bartered Bride. The concentration camp had so many musicians that two separate full symphony orchestras could perform at one time, along with various chamber ensembles. Alongside the existence of numerous choirs, cabaret groups, classical and popular orchestras, music criticism was written, music instruction was given, and a studio for modern music was created and led by the composer Victor Ullmann. New pieces of music in the most varied styles were composed and premiered in Theresienstadt. And music thus really became a means of retaining the identities of both the musicians and the listeners. Music simultaneously served to promote survival and signified hope for a better world. So, the Nazis kept a very tight rein on the world's perception of activities within Terezin. In a propaganda effort designed to fool the Western Allies, the Nazis exploited the rich cultural life within the camp. They described the camp as a spa town and a retirement community. In 1944, Terezin received a visit from the International Red Cross as ordered by the King of Denmark. The Nazis permitted this visit in order to dispel any rumors about the extermination camps. Weeks of preparation preceded this visit. The Nazis ordered prisoners to pave streets, repair housing. They built a playground. They built fake shops and fake cafes and even planted over 1,000 rose bushes, just to imply that the Jews lived in comfort. The area was cleaned up, and the Nazis deported many Jews to Auschwitz to minimize the appearance of overcrowding in Terezin. As part of this charade, the Nazis compelled the Czech composer and conductor Raphael Schechter, who we'll talk about a little bit later, to put together a performance of Verdi's Requiem. After such a successful experience using Terezin as a supposed model internment camp during the Red Cross visit, the Nazis decided to make a propaganda film there. It was directed by Jewish prisoner Kurt Geron, an experienced director and actor. Shooting took 11 days, starting September 1st, 1944, and after the film was completed, most of the cast and the director were deported to Auschwitz. Geron, the director, perished within a month of his arrival. So I want to show just a few short clips from this propaganda film. The first shows Jews in the ghetto happily gardening, appearing to be completely at leisure. The second, a soccer match that appears similar to any sports game that you might see today. It's almost unnaturally normal looking. And the third is a performance, which was conducted by one of the most important musicians in Terezin, the conductor Karl Anserl. Seeing the orchestra perform and watching the audience listen, you would never know the horrors of the daily life in this camp. So here's a little bit of this propaganda film directed by Kurt Geron. So I find that film chilling just to watch because it looked so normal almost, everything about it, and it really wasn't. So I want to get to talking about some of the specific musicians and composers and personalities who were so prominent in Terezin. And the first is Raphael Schechter. Schechter was born in Brăila, Romania on the 27th of May in 1905. He went to Prague after the First World War to study piano, composition, and conducting at the Prague Conservatory. After his studies, Schechter worked in an avant-garde theater, and then he established a chamber opera company in 1937 that played neglected Baroque music. However, Nazi persecution soon forced Schechter to reduce his musical activities to private lessons and home concerts. In November of 1941, he arrived at Theresienstadt, and soon after his arrival began to organize singers and instrumentalists. He really was a pioneer of the cultural life in the ghetto. In the summer of 1942, Schechter began to rehearse Smetana's The Bartered Bride. The premiere of the opera took place on November 28, 1942, with no sets, no costumes, and Schechter accompanied the ensemble on a battered baby grand piano. The performance was celebrated as a great musical act and was so successful that it was repeated 35 times. In September of 1943, Schechter was ordered by the SS to conduct Verdi's Requiem. Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi official responsible for orchestrating the final solution, attended the performance and was heard saying, "Those crazy Jews singing their own Requiem." But many accounts from survivors who were there and who even sang in the choir remember how meaningful it was to be able to sing to the Nazis what they could not say out loud. And so it was actually a remarkable act of defiance. For instance, according to some, the Requiem was kind of like a code to those who performed it. There's an organization that I'll talk about a little bit later called the Defiant Requiem Foundation, led by the American conductor Murray Sidlin. In an interview, Sidlin describes how the text of the Requiem talks about the end of the world and what happens to those who commit evil. Even as they were facing their own destruction, the Jews in that choir were telling the Nazis how the Third Reich was doomed. After that performance of the Requiem, the initial group that performed was deported to Auschwitz. But Schechter organized additional choirs to go on to perform the Verdi 15 more times. In October of 1944, the SS asked Schechter to stage Verdi's Requiem again, this time for the Red Cross visit. And it was after this last performance that Schechter himself was finally transported to Auschwitz, and then after that to 3 other death camps until he finally died 1 month before Czechoslovakia was liberated. I wanted to play for you this clip by a woman named Marianka Zadakov, who was in Schechter's choir, who sang the Verdi, and wanted you to hear her words from herself.
Sara, before you hit play, would you make sure that you're sharing your computer audio?
Oh, sure.
It's very faint, but it was in German. We didn't hear any of the music though, just barely. So.
Oh no. Okay.
Yeah, I'll let you know if people can't hear, and then we'll go from there.
Okay. All right.
We lost some settings when we lost power.
I did lose the settings when we lost power. Sorry about that. Okay. I just fixed it. Whoops. Hold on. Oh no. Okay, 1 sec. Let's go back to that page. Oh, I'm sorry you weren't able to hear the music. But that clip, that film is on YouTube. If you search for Kurt Garron, Terezin propaganda film, you will find it. So Here is Marianka Zadikov speaking about the Verdi Requiem. And let me know if you cannot hear this. Ah, sorry.
Within the weeks that we were studying the Requiem, Raphael Schechter told us the entire lifetime story of Verdi, and also that there are many, many other requiems written by other composers, and he mentioned them. And then he said, I chose this particular, the Verdi Requiem, for one reason only. There is loud and clear come the words, whatever we do here on earth will be heard and seen. The day will come when you will come before the judge, and the judge has the book open and knows everything you did, all the good and the bad things, and you will be treated according to what you did on earth. And Raphael Schechter said, we cannot say these things to them, that the day of judgment will come and they will get what they deserve, but we can sing it to them. Many of our enemies, of course, he didn't say it that way. I'm saying it now. It is clear that whoever came in a certain uniform belonged to a certain group of people. And among them, while we were singing, actually, there was Eichmann. I saw him there myself for the first time, because a friend of mine who knew what he looked like asked me to move the temporary curtain we had for a moment before we started singing. And then she said, if you look through this little hole and you make a line, straight line, you will see there are so and so many people in SS uniform. And in the middle of them is one man who is not wearing a uniform. He wears a certain cap or jacket or whatever, and you will recognize him. That's Eichmann. It's very hard to say what we felt when, with each transport that left, groups of 20, 50, 60, 19. There were always people from the Requiem who were very, very important in order to sing it again. So it was never sung anymore after that day in June. Listening to the music may remind many of the people in the audience that they have been to theaters and had heard operas like the ones that was now performed in Terezin. We did our best to sound good, and we did our best to learn our words, whether they were Czech, German, or Latin. But the important part was there was something in that music that was good for everyone, for those who heard it, but also for those who sang it.
So the next musician I'd like to talk about is Hans Krasse. Now, Krasse was born in Prague in November 1899. His affluent family encouraged and generously supported his musical studies, to the extent that his father hired instrumentalists and ensembles in order for the young Hans to hear the compositions that he wrote. Krasse studied with Alexander Zemlinsky in Prague, and in 1921, even prior to the completion of his studies, he began working as a vocal coach at the New German Opera. He followed his teacher, Zemlinsky, to the Berlin Kroll Opera in 1927, and although the support of Zemlinsky brought him conducting offers in Berlin, Paris, and Chicago, He could not bring himself to accept a foreign post and returned to Prague, where he enjoyed supposedly a very leisurely lifestyle, just as inclined to play chess and discuss literature as to engage in musical projects. His bohemian lifestyle inhibited active composition, so his output was small, but the music he composed was received with high acclaim. Krasa, of course, did not escape from Prague before German occupation in 1939, and he was deported to Terezin in 1942. He was most well known by one very important work, Brundibar, an opera written in 1938 to be performed by children. He wrote it as an entry for a children's opera competition, and it received its premiere in German-occupied Prague by children at a Jewish orphanage under the baton of none other than Raphael Schechter. Brundibar had one additional performance before the mass transports of Jews to Terezin began in 1942. In 1943, in July, the score of Brundibar was smuggled into the camp, where it was reorchestrated by Krasa for the various instrumentalists who were available at the time. The Terezin premiere took place on September 23, 1943. Realizing the enormous propagandistic potential of this enormously popular artistic endeavor, the Nazis arranged a special new staging of Brundibar for their propaganda film, and the same production was performed for the inspection of Terezin by the International Red Cross in September of 1944. That would be the last of the 55 performances in the Terezin ghetto. Krasa left for Auschwitz on October 16, 1944, and perished immediately in a gas chamber upon his arrival. Brundibar was an opera about children triumphant over an evil ruler. But ironically, the Nazis did not ban this opera like they did other works, only because the libretto was in Czech, so the SS guards didn't understand it and completely missed the metaphor. So this is a short clip of the actual performance from Terezin of the children there singing Brundibar. Gideon Klein. Klein was born in Prerov, Moravia in December 1919. Gifted from an early age, Klein began piano lessons at the age of 6, and by the time he was 11, he was regularly traveling from Moravia to Prague for lessons. In the fall of 1938, he began university at the Prague Conservatory. But by March the next year, the Nazis had closed all institutions of higher learning as part of their occupation of Czechoslovakia. Looking to be able to continue his studies somehow, he secured a scholarship to attend the Royal Conservatory of Music in London. But by that time, the Nazi emigration laws prevented Jews from being able to leave the Czech Republic, so he was forced to stay in Prague. Klein was able to continue performing under a pseudonym to hide his Jewish roots, until even that became too dangerous. Finally, on December 1st, 1941, Klein was arrested and deported to Terezin, where he immediately became an integral part of the camp's cultural life. He formed chamber groups, accompanied large-scale performances, including that of the Verdi Requiem, performed solo recitals, and he blossomed as a composer. As a solo piano recitalist in Terezin, you could hear Gideon Klein performing Mozart's Adagio, Beethoven's sonatas, Schumann's fantasies, Brahms's intermezzi, Joseph Suk's Life and Dreams, as well as pieces by Janacek and Schoenberg and Scriabin. Concerts, popular demand dictated repeat performances, and each one of Gideon's solo and chamber music programs were given up to 11 times. Klein's compositions in Terezin include chamber music for strings, choral works, madrigals, a piano sonata, incidental music for the theater, and a song cycle. His fellow composer, Hans Krasse, decided to make a plan to save the music the two of them had written in Terezin. When their own departure was inevitable, they entrusted their manuscripts to Irma Semtska, Gideon's last girlfriend in the ghetto, instructing her to give them to his sister, Eliska, should she survive the war and they meet again. Well, Irma did survive the war. She remained in Terezin until its liberation, and she did meet Eliska again in Prague after the war, and gave the precious manuscripts to her, together with an oil portrait of Gideon. Eliska worked tirelessly on behalf of Gideon's music and arranged the first complete concert of his works in June 1946. Klein was sent to Auschwitz in September 1944, but ended up dying in Fürstengrube, a coal mining camp in Poland, in January 1945, 2 months after his 25th birthday, just as Allied forces were beginning to liberate the camps. The string trio that I'm going to play you a little bit of is the final piece that Klein composed in his life. He finished it in September 1944, just 9 days before being sent to Auschwitz. It was finally published 50 years after its composition. And this piece is one that we're featuring on our concert on Monday night. So if you like what you hear, you'll get to hear more of it if you tune in on Monday. So the following is an excerpt of the middle movement, which is longer than the combined durations of the energetic outer movements. This amazingly beautiful movement is a set of variations on a Moravian folk song called the Nezdeb Tower, a song about a wild goose flying high up into a tall tower. This symbol of freedom, referencing Klein's own Moravian roots, had strong resonance for the imprisoned Klein, and was a link to his idyllic childhood. Using this wistful melody, Klein creates a set of variations, which really is the emotional heart of the trio. Here's a little bit of that middle movement. Pick a place to stop because that whole movement is so beautiful, but you can always find it and listen to the rest of it on your own. So our next composer, musician, Victor Ullmann. Ullmann was born in Teschen, Silesia in January 1898 and grew up and was educated in Vienna. He participated in Schoenberg's advanced courses in 1918 through 1919, and at Schoenberg's recommendation, became one of Alexander Zemlinsky's conducting assistants at the New German Theater in Prague in the 1920s. Ullmann became the first Kapellmeister at the Municipal Theater in Aussig in 1927, and in both cities, Ullmann enjoyed a reputation as an excellent, conscientious, and capable conductor. Following unsuccessful efforts to find work in London or South Africa, Ullmann, too, was trapped in Prague after the German invasion in 1939. In 1942, he was deported to Terezin. Ullmann was incredibly prolific in Terezin. He had an impressive list of original compositions: 3 piano sonatas, a string quartet, several dozen song cycles, orchestral works, and an opera called The Emperor of Atlantis, Der Kaiser von Atlantis. Ullmann also made, upon request, a number of vocal arrangements of Yiddish and Hebrew songs. In addition to his extensive concert reviews, he wrote several essays, an opera libretto, and a literary diary, The Strange Passenger, a collection of poems and aphorisms. Ullmann was soon one of the leading figures in the musical scene at the camp. He was in charge of trying to organize the inmates' leisure. He was also important as the director of the Studio for New Music, as a critic and as a performer and composer. Ullmann was deported to Auschwitz on October 16, 1944, in one of the last transports where he died in the gas chambers. But before his transport, Ullmann was able to give his Terezin manuscripts to the German philosopher, psychologist, and art theorist Professor Utitz, who gave them to the German poet and novelist H.G. Adler after the war. The Kaiser of Atlantis was Ullmann's most famous work written at Terezin. It's a one-act opera, and he composed it in 1943. In the prologue, the loudspeaker character describes the situation in which the living no longer laugh, the dying no longer die, and life and death have lost their meanings. Death, the character, finding this all repulsive, goes on strike, and no one is allowed to die anymore. The music and the text mirror much of the tension and anxiety which the Terezin inhabitants felt in the camp. Rehearsals began in Terezin in September 1944, but both censorship and increasing transports to Auschwitz prevented a production. The premiere didn't take place until December 1975 by the Netherlands Opera. It's purported that this opera was actually the reason for Ullmann's deportation. It was too controversial, and he had to be silenced. The work was banned from being performed because the Nazi guards suspected that the character of the Kaiser in the opera was written as a satire of Hitler. So I'm going to play you this little clip, which is conveniently a trailer from an opera company that gives you little glimpses into bits and pieces of the entire opera.
Auf Jahr hat Weil will uns niemand kaufen, will uns niemand kaufen. Und die Vernichtung des Bösen in unserem an Ecken. Aufruf im Rundfunk. Trommler in den Dörfern. Wir überall, der einzige, schenken unseren verdienten Soldaten ein Geheimmittel zum ewigen Leben. Wer es besitzt, ist gefeit gegen den Tod und keine Wunde und keine Krankheit kann ihn wohl anheben. Das Schwert für seinen Herrn und das Vaterland, sie will ein Stachel helle, wo ist dein Weg?
All right. Thanks to the Greenwich Music Festival for that clip. All right, so the last musician I'd like to talk about is Pavel Haas. Haas was born to a prominent Jewish family in the Moravian capital of Brno in June 1899. By the age of 14, he had already produced his earliest attempts at formal composition. At the Brno Conservatory, Haas studied from 1920 to 22 with the eminent composer Janáček. During the 1930s, Haas thrived in the world of film composition, and he wrote several notable scores for both stage and film. But after the Nazi occupation, of course, performances of his works were eventually banned, and he and his wife were forbidden employment. In 1938, in desperation, he wrote to the relatives of his wife in New Jersey and also to a former student of Janáček's. An attempt was launched by these Americans to help Haas secure passage to the U.S., but this help came too late. Prior to his arrest, he officially divorced his wife in order to protect her and their young daughter. And on December 2nd, 1941, Haas was sent on a transport to Terezin. Although at first he was too depressed and too ill to compose, he returned to some kind of creative productivity when the energetic Gideon Klein put several sheets of blank music paper in front of him and urged him to return to his work. He later became an important part of the rich musical life of the camp, writing several works that are considered classics of that time, including The Study for Strings, which was another piece featured in the Nazi propaganda film. You can even see Haas taking a bow in the film. In case you hadn't noticed a trend yet, October 16th, 1944. This was the date of transport to Auschwitz for almost every single one of the musicians that I've discussed tonight, including Pavel Haas, Gideon Klein, Hans Krasse, Victor Ullmann, and also Karl Anserl, the conductor that you saw in the propaganda film. They all left Terezin for Auschwitz in the same transport. And according to Anserl, who was the only one who survived, 3 out of 4 composers, Haas, Ullmann, and Krasse, were sent to the gas chambers immediately upon arrival. Klein, of course, survived that transport, but then died at a later camp in Poland in 1945. The Study for Strings survived thanks to the initiative of the conductor Karl Anserl, who performed the work several times in Terezin. Although the scores were lost, Anserl managed to find the orchestral parts in the camp after the war, with the exception of that for the double bass. That part was added later by one of Haas's students. Here is a little bit of Pavel Haas's Study for Strings. neglected to mention that this particular YouTube video of the study for strings features photos of Pavel Haas and also many photos of just life in Terezin at the time. So it's quite an educational video just for some of those photos as well. So, despite desperate conditions, it's telling that not only were the artistic spirits of these composers and musicians not dampened, but their creativity actually thrived. Were they productive despite their fate or because of it? What's also telling is that despite the fact that each of these musicians' musical output ended in 1944, their music plays on to this day, even more defiantly than it did in their short lifetimes. This is due in part to the incredibly important work of several organizations that I want to mention. First is the Terezin Music Foundation. This is a nonprofit based in Boston, dedicated to amplifying the musical legacy of the artists imprisoned in Terezin. And Terezin Music Foundation performs and records music from Terezin. They produce concerts and events across the US and Europe. They sponsor, premiere, and record new commissions. In fact, one of those new commissions is the Andre Previn piece that will be presenting on our concert on Monday night. They also teach about Terezin and the Holocaust in schools and houses of worship, and lead student and adult tours of Terezin in Prague. The next organization that I've mentioned briefly previously is the Defiant Requiem Foundation. This is a nonprofit based in DC and founded by the conductor Murray Sidlin to share the story of Raphael Schechter and the Terezin prisoners who used music and art as an act of defiance to maintain their humanity, dignity, hope, and inspiration. The Defiant Requiem Foundation uses original performance art, documentary film, and new educational materials to offer a unique approach to addressing contemporary issues of bigotry, human rights violations, mass atrocity, and genocide crimes. And I would encourage you to check out the film that they produced, The Defiant Requiem, which tells the story of Schechter and the Verdi Requiem performance that took place in Terezin, or performances. And lastly, the Oral Foundation, which is a nonprofit founded by James Conlon, whose mission is to encourage interest in and especially encourage the performance of works by composers suppressed as a result of Nazi policies from 1933 to 1945. They encourage the performance of this music by professional and pre-professional musicians. They serve as a resource on their website and through consultation for musicians and organizations. They raise awareness of the importance of these composers in the history of 20th century music, provide lectures and multimedia programs, and seek new ways to bring greater attention to the music, lives, and influence of the composers who were suppressed by the Nazis. So I'll just finish with this very simple picture. It was created by Bedřich Fritta in 1943 and was given as a birthday gift to Edgar Krasa. Despite the name, Edgar was not directly related to Hans Krasa. He was actually the bunkmate of the conductor Raphael Schechter, and he sung in the choir for the Verdi Requiem. He survived the war and immigrated to Boston, where he died in 2017. Edgar and his testimony are actually featured in the film The Defiant Requiem. Two of the most prevalent features in the drawing, aside from the violin, are the prison barbs and the barbed wire around the instrument and the music. But what you begin to notice after you look a little more closely is the rays of sunlight streaming in through the window. You know, history has never been void of bleak times, but music and art are always those rays of sunshine that give us hope for a better future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sara, for a wonderful illuminating program. I know I have tears in my eyes just thinking of the talent and the life and the creativity that was just snuffed out. But like you said, the music lives on and it's still being performed. And that's just a beautiful thing.
Thank you.
Do we have any questions? Sarah, do you feel up to
Sure.
questions?
Yeah,
Okay.
I am no historian, but I but I am a musician who loves this music. So
Either raise your hand and I will try and find you in the participants list, or leave a question in the chat. And forgive me if it takes me just a couple of seconds to get acclimated and find you. But does anybody have any questions or comments? Okay. Well, let me read some of them in the chat. Of course, a lot of thank yous. What a wonderful program. Thank you, Sarah, for a moving presentation. This was obviously a heartbreaking task. Great presentation. We all agree on that. Any questions? Any other comments? Be sure to click on chambermusiconthefox.org for information about Monday's concert. A final comment, thank you for the program. I cannot ever fathom what the history showed today. Indeed. Thank you very much for attending, for taking part of your Thursday evening to share with us, and in remembrance of the 6 million people who died in the concentration camps, among them many musicians and artists and ordinary people just like you and me. Thank you very much for your support of the library and your support of music and the arts here in our community. Thank you and good night.